My mother's love is a beautifully wrapped cage. You have to understand that to understand any of this. It's gilded, intricate, and from the outside, it looks like a privilege. But inside, the bars are cold and unyielding. Her name is Eleanor Vance, and she is the architect of perfection. Our world, the Vance world, is one of old money, crisp linen, and silent judgments. It's a world where your worth is measured by the cut of your suit, the pedigree of your education, and the social standing of the person on your arm. I, Alexander Vance, was her masterpiece, her only son, the heir to a legacy of being impeccable. And I was failing. For years I'd managed. I wore the bespoke suits. I ran the family's charitable foundation with a steady, if uninspired, hand. I dated women from the right families, with the right last names and the wrong, hollow eyes. But I was 35 now, and the pressure had shifted. It was no longer about who I was dating, but when I would finally provide a wife. A suitable wife, the final piece to cement her perfect world. The Crawford's son is getting married in June, she'd say over afternoon tea, her voice like chilled champagne. Such a lovely girl, Charlotte Pembroke. Her father owns half of the North Coast. It was never a direct command. It was a reminder of the scoreboard, a nudge to get back in the game. The breaking point was the Hawthorne Gala, the social event of the season. I arrived alone as usual and found my mother holding court near the ice sculpture. She introduced me to a woman named Genevieve. Genevieve, this is my son, Alexander. Alexander, Genevieve's grandfather, and your grandfather were at Princeton together. Genevieve was polished to a high shine. She smiled with perfectly straight, brilliantly white teeth. We made small talk about sailing and the stock market. It was like talking to a very attractive, very expensive AI, and my mother watched us like a conductor, waiting for the perfect harmony to begin. Later that night, as the party dwindled, she took my arm. She's perfect for you, Alexander, don't you think? The Pembrokes and the Vances. It would be a merger, not just a marriage. A merger. That's what it was all about. Merging bloodlines, merging fortunes, merging social capital. My happiness was a minor variable in the equation, an acceptable loss for a greater gain. I looked at her, at the unwavering certainty in her eyes, and I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry a Genevieve. I would suffocate. But I also knew I couldn't just say no. The fallout would be a cold war that would last for years. I needed a nuclear option, a lie so grand, so audacious, it would shock her system and buy me my freedom. The idea came to me in a flash of desperate, cynical inspiration. If she wanted a fiancé, I would give her one. But not one from her world. I would bring in someone from the world she pretended didn't exist. Someone who would be so utterly, fundamentally wrong that the sheer horror of it would make her drop the entire subject of my marriage forever. I needed an actress, but not a real one. A real actress would have ambition, a career, complications. I needed a ghost. Someone with no ties, no history, no one to miss her. Someone who would do it for the money and then disappear. That's how I found myself driving to the underpass near the old industrial district, a place my mother would never in 1,000 lifetimes set foot in. The air smelled of diesel and damp concrete. A small community of the forgotten had built a fragile village of tents and tarps against the rust-colored walls. And that's where I saw her. She wasn't begging. She was sitting on an overturned plastic crate, reading a battered copy of Jane Austen's Persuasion to a scruffy-looking dog. Her clothes were worn, layered against the chill, but her hands, holding the book, were clean. Her voice, as she read to the uninterested animal, was low, clear, and carried an unexpected, educated cadence. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. I parked my obscenely expensive car a block away and walked towards her, my shoes crunching on gravel. The dog growled, a low rumble in its chest. She looked up and I saw her eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, and they held no fear, only a weary, profound resignation. She closed the book, her finger marking the page. "Can I help you?" she asked. There was no hostility, just a simple, tired question. My rehearsed speech evaporated. I stood there, a man in a $5,000 coat, offering a woman living under a bridge a role in the most absurd play ever conceived. "My name is Alexander," I said, my voice sounding alien, even to me. I have a very unusual proposition for you." She listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't laugh, didn't get angry. She just listened as I laid out the insane plan. I would pay her to be my fiancée for 2 months. She would live in a luxury apartment I provided, wear clothes I bought her, and accompany me to family functions. All she had to do was play the part. Her name would be Isabel. When I finished, there was a long silence. The dog whined, nudging her hand. "Why?" she finally asked, her gaze piercing. "Why me?" "Because you can read Austen without stumbling," I said, the truth tumbling out. "And because you look like you could use a warm bed and a hot meal. And because no one will look for you when this is over." She looked down at the book in her lap, then at the dog, then back at me. I saw the calculation in her eyes, the war between pride and survival. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I named a figure. It was a life-changing amount of money. Enough to get a real start, to never have to sleep under a bridge again. She flinched, as if I'd struck her. Then she nodded slowly. "My name is Maya," she said. Not Isabel, Maya. It was her first condition, a tiny reclaiming of her identity. I agreed. I drove her to a boutique hotel I'd booked under a false name. I left her with a wad of cash for essentials and a promise to return the next day to begin the transformation. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. She was standing under the hotel's awning, looking small and lost, the automatic doors sliding shut behind her like the gates of a prison she'd just willingly entered. I felt a twist of guilt, sharp and acidic. I was using her desperation as a weapon against my mother. It was the most callous thing I had ever done. But as I pulled into the manicured driveway of my family's estate, seeing the lights blazing in the windows, I hardened my resolve. This was a war, and Maya was my secret weapon. I just had no idea that in bringing a stranger from the outside in, I was about to shatter the gilded cage for good. The transformation of Maya into Isabel was a surreal week-long production. I hired a stylist, a woman named Colette, with a severe black bob and a no-nonsense attitude, who asked no questions when I told her my fiancée had been living abroad in remote areas and had lost all her belongings. I sat in a plush chair, watching as Colette sheared off Maya's ragged, split-ended hair into a chic, shoulder-length bob. The grime of the streets was washed away in a marble shower, revealing pale, clear skin. When she emerged from the dressing room in a simple, elegant navy dress, I barely recognized her. The clothes she'd been wearing had been a form of camouflage. Without them, she was striking. Not in the polished, generic way of the Genevieves of the world, but with a quiet, unassuming grace. The weary resignation in her eyes remained, but now it looked like thoughtful depth. "Well?" she asked, her voice hesitant as she gestured to the dress. "Will I pass inspection?" "The clothes are fine," I said, more brusquely than I intended. "It's the story that matters." I had crafted a background for her. Isabel Reed, an academic researcher specializing in indigenous cultures, recently returned from a long field study in Patagonia. It explained her lack of social media presence, her vague past, and her supposed worldly simplicity. We practiced in the safe house apartment. I taught her the key players, my mother, Eleanor, the Queen, my late father, a titan of industry whose portrait still loomed large, the aunts, the uncles, the family friends. I drilled her on the fictional details of her life. She was a quick study, astonishingly so. She absorbed the information, asked intelligent questions, and began to embody the role with a quiet conviction that unnerved me. It was more than just memorization. It was a performance of a lifetime. The first test was a small, informal dinner at my mother's house. I was a knot of nervous tension. Maya, now Isabel, was preternaturally calm. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and pearls, her hand resting lightly on my arm as we walked in. "Mother," I said, my voice too bright. "This is Isabel." My mother's eyes, the color of flint, swept over her. I saw her catalog, the dress, understated, expensive, the shoes, sensible, Italian, the hair, well cut, not trendy. It was a passing grade, but just barely. "Isabel," my mother said, offering a cheek for a kiss that never quite connected. "Alexander has told me so little about you. We were beginning to think you were a myth." "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mrs. Vance," Maya said, her voice steady, her smile warm but not effusive. "Alexander speaks of you with such admiration." The dinner was a minefield. My mother lobbed subtle, probing questions like grenades. "And your family, Isabel? Where are they from?" "They passed away some years ago," Maya said, her gaze dropping to her plate for a moment, a flicker of genuine sorrow in her eyes that was so convincing it hurt to watch. "It's just me now." It was a masterstroke. It invoked pity and closed down further inquiry in one graceful move. "I understand you're an academic. Such an interesting choice. Not very lucrative, is it?" "It's a passion," Maya replied, meeting my mother's gaze squarely. "I've never been particularly motivated by money. I find it often complicates things that should be simple." There was a beat of stunned silence. No one talked to Eleanor Vance like that. No one. I held my breath, waiting for the icy retort. But it never came. My mother simply tilted her head, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. "How refreshing," she said, and took a sip of wine. As the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. Maya didn't try to impress. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was with a sincerity that was utterly alien in that room. She talked about the importance of community, about the stories she'd collected in her fictional travels, about the kindness of strangers. She spoke with a quiet authority that didn't come from wealth or status, but from what seemed like lived experience. My mother, for the first time I could remember, was listening. truly listening. On the drive home, I was euphoric. You were incredible. You had her completely fooled. Maya was staring out the window at the passing lights, her profile pale and still. "She's very lonely," she said softly. I laughed. "My mother? She's the most connected woman in the city." "No," Maya said, turning to look at me. Her winter sky eyes were clear and certain. "That's not connection. That's networking. There's a difference. She's surrounded by people and utterly alone." Her words silenced me. They cut through my smug satisfaction and struck a chord of truth I didn't want to acknowledge. The performance continued. We attended a charity auction, a garden party. Each time, Isabel charmed everyone she met. She wasn't performing the way I'd expected. She wasn't playing a high society princess. She was playing herself, just with a different name and a cleaner history. And people were drawn to her. They found her authenticity, a complete fabrication on my part, to be a breath of fresh air. And I was beginning to forget it was a performance. The feel of her hand in mine started to feel less like a prop and more like a connection. The way she'd look at me across a room, a small private smile on her lips, felt real. The guilt I'd felt initially began to curdle into something more complicated, more dangerous. I was the one who was being fooled. I was falling for my own con. The night before the big family reunion, the climax of our charade, we were back at the apartment. She was standing on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the city. "You're ready for tomorrow," I said, coming to stand beside her. She didn't look at me. "Do you ever wonder what my real story is, Alexander? The one before the underpass?" The question startled me. I realized I'd been actively avoiding it. Her real story was a complication, a variable I hadn't accounted for. "It doesn't matter," I said, the words sounding hollow and cruel even to me. She finally turned her head, and the look in her eyes was one of such profound sadness that it stole my breath. "It matters to me," she whispered. She went inside, leaving me alone on the balcony, with the cold and the city lights and the dawning, terrifying realization that I had not just hired an actress. I had unleashed a truth-teller into my perfectly constructed lie, and I was no longer sure who was being exposed more, my mother or me. The Vance family reunion was the Super Bowl of social pretense. It was held at the country club, a sprawling monument to manicured greens and unspoken rules. Every branch of the family tree was there, a sea of critical eyes and practiced smiles. This was it, the final act. If we could survive this, the lie would be cemented, my mother would be pacified, and I would be free. Maya, as Isabel, was a vision in emerald green. She looked the part so perfectly it was terrifying. But as I took her arm, I felt a fine tremor running through her. The preternatural calm was gone. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice low. She offered a tight smile. "Just stage fright." We entered the lion's den. The introductions were a blur of names and titles. Maya played her part, but the effortless charm of before was strained. She was polite, engaged, but I could see the effort it now cost her. Her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes. The crisis happened during lunch. We were seated at the head table with my mother and a few of the most formidable aunts. The conversation, as it always did, turned to the past. A story about my grandfather and his business acumen. Aunt Lydia, a woman with the presence of a hawk, sighed nostalgically. Those were the days when a man's word was his bond. When people knew their place and had a little dignity, I felt Maya go rigid beside me. Indeed, my mother agreed, taking a delicate sip of iced tea. There's a lack of grit in the world today, a sense of entitlement. No one is willing to start from the bottom and work their way up anymore. It was a standard, vapid commentary from people who had been born on the top floor. I'd heard it 1,000 times. I usually just tuned it out. But Maya didn't. She slowly set her fork down. The soft clink was deafening in our small circle. "The bottom," she repeated, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the ambient chatter. "What do any of you know about the bottom?" The table went silent. All eyes turned to her. I froze, a piece of salmon halfway to my mouth. "Isabel, darling," I began, a warning in my tone. She ignored me. Her gaze was fixed on my mother. The weary resignation I'd seen under the bridge was gone, replaced by a raw, blazing intensity. "The bottom is cold," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It is sleeping with one eye open, because you're afraid someone will steal the shoes off your feet. It's choosing between a meal and a bus fare. It's the way people look straight through you, as if you're not even there, because your poverty is an inconvenience to their day." My mother's face was a mask of frozen astonishment. Aunt Lydia's mouth was hanging slightly open. "Maya, stop," I hissed, panic clawing at my throat. She turned her fiery gaze on me, and the sound of her real name in that context was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Maya," my mother whispered. It was over. The jig was up. The entire elaborate facade crumbled in an instant. But Maya wasn't finished. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the flagstones. She looked at my mother, not with anger, but with a devastating, soul-deep pity. "You talk about grit, Eleanor? You have no idea. Grit isn't closing a business deal. Grit is surviving another night when you have nothing and no one. Dignity isn't about knowing your place. It is about holding on to your humanity when the world is doing everything it can to strip it from you." She looked around the table at the stunned, silent faces of my family. "Your son hired me. He found me under a bridge, reading a book to a dog, and he paid me to pretend to be the kind of woman he thought you would approve of. And for a while, I did it. For the money. So I could eat. So I could sleep in a bed. But I can't do it anymore. I can't sit here and listen to you judge a world you've never had to see." She turned her eyes back to my mother, and her voice dropped, becoming soft, almost intimate, and all the more powerful for it. "He did this because he's terrified of you. Because your love comes with so many conditions, it's strangling him. You wanted to know who I am? I'm the mirror, and you don't like what you see." With that, she turned and walked away. She didn't run. She walked with her head high through the silent dining room, past the gaping members of my family, and out the door. The silence she left behind was absolute. Then it was broken by a chorus of outraged whispers. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a torrent of emotions, humiliation, terror, and a shocking, undeniable surge of awe. She had detonated a bomb in the middle of my life, and part of me was cheering. I slowly forced myself to look at my mother. I expected fury, ice, a dismissal that would freeze me out forever. But what I saw shattered me more completely than Maya's speech ever could. My mother was crying. Not the delicate, pretty crying of a society woman. These were silent, wrenching sobs that shook her slender frame. Tears streamed down her carefully composed face, tracing paths through her makeup. She wasn't looking at me or at anyone. She was staring at the space where Maya had been, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a kind of horrified revelation. She saw me then, really saw me. And in her eyes I saw the gilded bars of the cage, not just around me, but around her too, and for the first time I saw that she knew they were there. The performance was over. The lie was dead. But as I sat there in the wreckage, watching my mother weep, I realized the truth was only just beginning. I found Maya back at the apartment. She had already changed out of the emerald dress and was packing her few new things into a cheap duffel bag. She was leaving behind the clothes, the jewelry, everything I'd bought her. She was taking only what was hers. She didn't look up when I entered. "I'll be gone in 10 minutes. You can keep the money." "I don't want it." "Stop," I said, my voice rough. She finally looked at me. Her face was clean of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She looked more like the woman under the bridge than she had in weeks, but there was a new strength in her posture, a finality. "Why, Maya?" I asked, the question torn from me. "Why did you do that?" "Because it was the truth," she said simply. "And I was tired of carrying it for you. You hired me to be a shock to her system. Well, mission accomplished. You ruined everything. No Alexander. I set you free, and I set myself free too. I was starting to forget who I was in all this." She gestured around the luxurious, sterile apartment. "I was becoming your creature. And that's a different kind of homelessness." Her words landed like a physical blow. I sank onto the sofa, my head in my hands. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only a vast, hollow exhaustion. "What's your story?" I asked, the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. "The real one." She zipped up the duffel bag and sat on the edge of the bed, facing me. She told me. It wasn't a dramatic tale of addiction or crime. It was a slow, crushing slide. A teaching career she'd loved wiped out by budget cuts. A savings account drained by a medical emergency for a parent she'd cared for until they died. A car that broke down, making it impossible to get to a new job. An eviction. The first night in a shelter, then the first night in the car, then the first night under the bridge. It was the story of how easily the bottom can fall out, how thin the line is between stability and despair for most people. "I wasn't lazy. I wasn't entitled," she said, her voice steady. "I was unlucky, and I had no net to catch me. Your family, you have nets made of gold. You don't even see them. You just assume the air is soft for everyone." I had no answer. I was ashamed. Profoundly, gut-wrenchingly ashamed. The doorbell rang. We both froze. No one knew about this place. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. My heart stopped. It was my mother. She stood alone in the hallway, no coat, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. Her eyes were puffy, but her gaze was clear. I opened the door, too stunned to speak. She didn't look at me. Her eyes went straight to Maya. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Maya nodded silently. My mother walked in, her heels clicking on the polished concrete. She stopped a few feet from Maya, looking at the duffel bag, at her old shoes, at her real face. "I owe you an apology," my mother said. The words sounded foreign coming from her mouth. "Not for the circumstances. What my son did was unspeakable." She shot me a look that was filled with a new, complex emotion, disappointment. Yes, but also a dawning understanding. But I owe you an apology for my blindness, for my cruelty." She took a shaky breath. "You were right about everything. I am lonely. I have spent my entire life building a beautiful, perfect prison because I was taught that was what mattered. And I was trying to build one for my son, too." She turned to me, her eyes glistening. "I am so sorry, Alexander." It was the first genuine, unconditional thing I had ever heard her say to me. She looked back at Maya. "The things you said about the bottom, no one has ever spoken to me like that. No one has ever been that honest." She hesitated, then asked a question that shocked me to my core. "Will you have dinner with me?" Maya looked as stunned as I felt. "What? A real dinner? Not as Isabel, as Maya? I would like to hear more, if you're willing." The world had truly turned upside down. Maya looked at me, then back at my mother. She slowly nodded. "Okay, that dinner happened. I wasn't invited. It was just the two of them. I don't know everything they talked about, but my mother came back changed, softer, less certain, and more human because of it. Maya didn't take the money. She let my mother, in a fit of profound and uncharacteristic guilt, use her connections to get her a legitimate, well-paying job at a non-profit literacy program. It was a hand up, not a handout, and Maya accepted it with her dignity intact. The lie of Isabel was the most dishonest thing I have ever done, but it forced a truth that nothing else could have. It broke the pattern. It shattered the mirrors we were all holding up to each other. My mother and I are in therapy now. Together, we're learning how to talk to each other without agendas. It's messy, and it's hard, but it's real. I saw Maya one last time before she moved into her own small apartment. I went to the park where she sometimes volunteered, reading to children. "I'm sorry," I said. It was all I could offer. She smiled, a real, gentle smile that reached her eyes. "I know. Thank you for that." "You were right," I said. I was terrified of her. And I was using you, but somewhere in the middle of it, it stopped being an act for me. She looked at me with those clear winter sky eyes, and she knew I was telling the truth. "I know," she said softly, "but some stories just aren't meant to have a happy ending together, Alexander. Ours was a bridge. We walked across it, and we found what we were looking for on the other side. Just not each other." She was right. She found her voice and her freedom. I found my mother, and my mother, for the first time, found her heart. I hired a homeless woman to be my fake fiancée to shock my mother. And she did. But the person who was most shattered, the person who was most changed, wasn't her. It was me, because sometimes the most destructive lies are the ones we tell ourselves to survive. And sometimes the most profound truths are delivered not by a prince, but by a woman with nothing left to lose, and everything to teach you about what it really means to be found.